appreciation to you for being a part of this important conversation around youth mental health. We're really proud of being able to host this event at Bryan, recognizing our commitment to mental health. In fact, next year we celebrate our 100th anniversary at Bryan, and thank you. It's important to know that mental health services has been an important part of our history. In fact, not only this broad continuum of mental health services that we're privileged to offer, but some important distinctions. We were one of the first in the regions to open a dedicated mental health emergency department. We opened our independent center for inpatient and outpatient substance abuse. And some of you may not know, in 1939, we were the first general hospital to offer inpatient adult psychiatric care. And so mental health has been an important part of our history, and we're grateful to be able to extend our commitment and recognition of mental health with this important conversation today. I'll now invite Lori Seibel, President and CEO of Community Health Endowment, to offer some additional opening remarks.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. It really is a pleasure to be here. Just a few, 10 or 11 days ago, we heard that the Surgeon General was going to be visiting us, and so many people sprung into action to make today happen, and we're really grateful for that. I do have to thank Bryan Medical Center for allowing us to come here and for this to use this space, but also their team. I have to call out Ashton Wyrick, who has been the point person for us on this project and who has just done a fabulous job. I also want to thank LNK-TV, Melissa and Bo and their crew, who are, as we speak, sending this off into the wavelengths for other people to watch. And so just like Thanksgiving dinner, it's like there's a lot of work that leads up to it. It happens really quickly, and then they'll be here cleaning up when it's over. So I'm grateful for that. I want to thank the groups, and I'm not sure they're here today, but we did visit. Dr. Murthy was out and visited at North Star High School this morning, the Boys and Girls Club there. He saw the Aviation Center, visited with their Hope Squad, and also we took a tour of the Visionary Youth's mobile barbershop, where they also do mentoring. And so thanks to those folks for being such great hosts to the Surgeon General. I have to thank my staff, especially Emily and Morgan, who are probably not in the room. They're probably still, oh, I see Emily back here. But I want to thank them because they both sprung into action, and this has been something they've been working incredibly hard on, as well as the Board of Trustees, of whom I serve, chaired so ably by Dr. Marilyn Moore, who is perhaps one of the biggest champions of children and youth our community has ever seen. So I'm grateful to them as well for supporting this effort. And finally, I want to thank the Mayor's Office for joining us in bringing this event to fruition, to Amanda Barker, our point person there. We've been attached at the hip lately, and so I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to work with her. And now I have the great pleasure to introduce the mayor. You know, I first met the mayor and her husband Scott when our children attended the same school, and from the moment I met them, I knew that they had a deep commitment to children, to youth, to their success, to their ability to prosper in this community, and that has not changed. And I think we've come full circle to a moment here where we continue to support children and youth in this community, only in a different capacity. And so it is always an honor to introduce the mayor, and it is my pleasure today. Mayor Larian Gaylord Baird.
Thank you so much, Lori, for the introduction, for your friendship over the years and your leadership in our community. We're so grateful to you and the Community Health Endowment Board of Trustees and staff for your 25 plus years of commitment to making Lincoln the healthiest city in America. So thank you for what you do in our city. And thank you for working so closely with our Lincoln-Lancaster County Health Department, led by the one and only Pat Lopez, the director of the Health Department, who is here with us today. And we really appreciate all you've done to make this community conversation come to fruition. Part of what makes our community so healthy is the extraordinary care and dedication of our healthcare professionals. And I want to thank the Bryan Medical Center CEO Eric Moss and his team here. Thank you so much for all you and your team do every day to save lives and to help the rest of us live our fullest. Thank you. And as you can see from this big crowd and the overflow, we are just really excited to be here. I want to acknowledge special guests in the room. We have City Council Chair Tom Beckius and City Councilman Benny Shobe. Thank you for your leadership and partnership and support of youth in this community. Let's give you a round of applause. We are just thrilled to be able to, and honored to be able to host the leading spokesperson of public health in America and the voice of a clarion call to address the impact of social media on youth mental health, to foster social connectedness, and to cultivate belonging as part and parcel of tending to our overall health and well-being. On behalf of our community, it is truly a pleasure to be welcoming today to Lincoln the Vice Admiral and Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy. And Dr. Murthy was confirmed by the U.S. Senate in March 2021 to serve as the 21st Surgeon General of the United States. Sorry about that feedback. It's not me. Phew! It's not me. I'm not the problem, it's not me. As the nation's top doctor, Dr. Murthy guides the Biden-Harris administration's efforts to support the health and well-being of all Americans, and he has worked tirelessly to address critical public health issues. He has issued Surgeon General advisories on the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, on the burnout of our healthcare professionals. Dr. Murthy also issued a Surgeon General's framework for mental health in the workplace, and he is the first Surgeon General to host a podcast, one called House Calls with Dr. Vivek Murthy, where he invites guests and listeners to explore how we all can build more connected and meaningful lives. As Vice Admiral of the U.S. Public Health Service Commissioned Corps, Dr. Murthy oversees more than 6,000 dedicated public health officers supporting underserved and vulnerable populations. Dr. Murthy previously served as the 19th Surgeon General under President Barack Obama. And raised in Miami, Dr. Murthy received his bachelor's degree from Harvard, his medical degree from the Yale School of Medicine, and his master's in business administration from the Yale School of Management. Last year, Dr. Murthy released a landmark Surgeon General's advisory regarding the impact of social media on youth mental health. Interest in this topic has just continued to climb, as have rates of anxiety, depression, and other mental health challenges post-pandemic. Here in Lincoln, we know that to truly be the safest and healthiest capital city in the country, we must purposefully protect the mental health of our youth. We are so thankful that Dr. Murthy is here today to share with us his brilliant mind and his beautiful heart, which will endow our community with valuable insights and guidance as we together continue to work to give our youth an even brighter future. I want to say thank you to each and every one of you here in the audience and tuning in for making this a true community conversation. Your give and take is what leads to taking action that gives our community members an even safer and brighter future. And we know good conversations become great ones in the hands of a skillful moderator. So I want to thank Michelle Suarez for guiding today's conversation and for providing such incredible leadership in our community, both as an educator and principal, as a former city council member and a current board member of the Community Health Endowment. Lincoln author and renowned clinical psychologist Mary Pfeiffer has said that, quote, "Paying attention is the purest form of love." So with her wise words in mind, let's give our attention, our love, and a big Lincoln welcome to Dr. Vivek Murthy.
Dr. Murthy, a warm welcome to Lincoln, Nebraska. Thank you for being here. We're honored to have you here.
Well, I'm so glad to be here. This is my first trip actually to Nebraska, and I'm just I've been wanting to come here for a while, but I'm just thrilled that this finally happened. I was telling the mayor and some of our security officers earlier today just how nice everyone has been who I have encountered here, including people on the street, people in restaurants. So I know that's the character of the community, but I'm so grateful for your warm hospitality. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, we have some prepared questions, and then later on we'll hope to have some questions from the audience. The Surgeon General advisories are issued for significant public health challenges that require immediate action and attention. So an example of that would be the Surgeon General's warning on tobacco packages. So what led you to issue an advisory on social media and youth mental health?
Well, so, I was thinking, as I do my work, about the conversations that I have with people around the country. And I think about it in part because one of the first things I was taught in medical school by my professors was that if you listen long enough to a patient, they'll usually tell you what's wrong with them, which is a problem because I think as doctors, we interrupt 19 seconds into the conversation or something of that sort. So I was trying to, when I first served in the Obama administration, as Surgeon General, I was trying to do a lot of listening in the beginning. And that actually gave me a lot of insights into shaping my agenda. I actually had a whole agenda that I had, shared publicly with the Senate during my confirmation hearings. And that shifted significantly once I started doing these listening sessions because people had just started talking about issues that were on their mind, that were worrying them, that I realized we had to focus on. One of those issues actually has been social media. So the most common question that I was getting from parents all across the country, whether it was in rural areas or urban areas on the coast and the heartland, was about whether social media was safe for their kids. And inside, many parents were actually asking that question from a place of worry. They were looking at what was happening to their children, and they were feeling like something was not quite right. And they were worried that technology was playing a role in that. So it was to answer that question that we ultimately put together what became the Surgeon General's advisory on social media and youth mental health. And in that advisory, we came to two conclusions. One is, to the question of is social media safe for my kids, there certainly is not enough evidence to say that the answer is yes. And in fact, the second conclusion we came to was that there was in fact mounting evidence that there were in fact harm associated with social media use that our kids were experiencing. And a couple of the data points I'll share with you, which really stood out to me. One was that when adolescents use 3 hours or more of social media a day, that's associated with a doubling in the risk of anxiety and depression. This is particularly concerning because you know how much the average amount of daily use is today among adolescents? It's 4.8 hours, right? So it's well above that threshold. The other point that was concerning to me was a statistic about what young people themselves were saying, which is they were telling us, nearly half of adolescents, that using social media made them feel worse about their body image. And that's very consistent with the feedback we get in roundtables, including the one today that I did with high school students here in Lincoln, where they say that being on social media makes them compare themselves constantly to other people. Now, many of us growing up compared ourselves to other people, right? We've been comparing ourselves to other people for millennia. That's a human thing to do. But I was comparing myself to like the 30 or 40 kids in my class, maybe to something I saw on TV. But now, like, if you're a young person using social media, you may scroll through thousands of images in a given day. Many of those may not even be real. They may be photo edited or doctored in some way. But the funny thing about the human brain is even though you know that they may not be doctored, that they may not be entirely real, you still compare yourself to those photos. And many young people are telling us that they feel worse about their bodies as a result of that. Like this, there were just more and more statistics that were telling us that there was real harm here. And that was a reason that I thought it was really important for us to put this out, because in addition to calling attention to the fact that there are harms, in addition to validating the concerns that so many parents had, and the thing that made me feel terrible is that many of these parents did not necessarily have scientific backgrounds. They would doubt them, right? And they would say, well, I'm not really a scientist, I'm not really a public health expert, so maybe I'm just worried about nothing. But a lot of times, parental instincts are right. And in this case, I think parents' instincts were telling them the right thing, just that there was something wrong. with how technology was actually impacting their kids. But the last thing I'll tell you is that we really wanted to not just describe the problem, but to really lay out what the solutions be. And that's what we dedicated a significant portion of the report to, was talking about the steps that we need to take as legislators, as in terms of the platforms, as parents, as schools, to actually start making social media safer and protecting our kids from so many of the harms that they're experiencing today.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. You certainly struck a chord. We have an overflow building. Okay, thank you. This will be so much better. Trying to balance. Great. So you struck a chord in our community with this topic, social media. We appreciate the comments about the harms and the idea that it's not a safe place necessarily, but there are some positives. Could you talk a little bit about the positives of social media?
Absolutely, yeah. And because there are mixed benefits and harms, which we detail in our advisory. And some of the benefits that the young people themselves will talk about is that sometimes social media can help them stay in touch with people. Sometimes it can help them find a community of people who have shared experiences or backgrounds, whereas they may not find people like that, like who are geographically close to them. And sometimes it lets young people express themselves creatively in ways that they might find harder to do, like in person. And so I think that the challenge, I think, with the conversation that we had been having for a number of years was one that said, well, if there are any benefits, then we shouldn't make any changes because we don't want to take away those benefits. But I'd ask you just to pause for a moment and think about like cars for a moment. And for those of you who are maybe a bit older, I put myself in that category, and you remember what it was like growing up when you were rolling around in the back of the station wagon, right? When your mom or dad was driving and nobody was wearing a seatbelt and nobody had to. But how many people remember that? That was my experience. Yeah, so everyone, right? Like these were times actually, like you think about the 70s and 80s, when the rate of fatalities from car accident-related deaths was actually pretty high, right? And what we didn't say in that circumstance is we didn't say, well, cars are helping people, though, get from point A to point B. So we really shouldn't, rock the boat here. Just don't change anything. Just accept all of those deaths as a price of modernity. Like, we didn't say that, right? We also didn't say go back to horses and buggies and get rid of these cars. But what we said is we have to make the cars safer because we want the benefits, but we don't want the harms. And that's actually the approach we have to take here with social media. We can acknowledge that there are some benefits, but what we should not do and cannot do is say that some benefits for some kids justify significant harms for many kids. Right? That's just not a balance that we should be okay with, that we should tolerate. We should push to make these safer, and we should push to have the evidence that they are in fact safer. So one of my concerns has been when platforms say, well, we've taken many steps to make our platform safer. I'm glad for that, but I want to know, have they actually worked to make the platform safer? And that's where we have not seen evidence that that is in fact the case, that the harms that I just described, the increase in risk of anxiety and depression symptoms, the effect on how kids feel about themselves, particularly about their body image, the erosion of time that was previously going to sleep and learning and in-person interaction that is being siphoned off as kids are inhabiting more of an online world. Are those getting better? We don't have data to see that tells us that any of the interventions that the companies are making are necessarily solving those problems for our kids. And that's why I think just in a very objective scientific way, we should demand transparency and demand results, right? And we should make sure that we have those because it's our kids' lives that are at stake, right? And we do this with a lot of other products kids use, by the way. Now, I have young kids. My kids are 6 and 7 right now. And, when we bought a car seat initially for them, when we thought about what kind of formula we should use, because we use formula for my son when he was a baby. Like, these are all times where we had to rely on an external standard that was established and that was implemented to make sure these are safe, right? Because it would be pretty unreasonable to tell a parent, before your child gets in the car at the age of 15, why don't you go inspect the frame, inspect the brakes, check out the engine, make sure this thing is, worthy of, driving on the road and sustaining during an accident. Like, we don't say that. We also don't say, go analyze every bottle of baby food that you buy, all the baby formula, to make sure that there's no contamination, because we know that's an unreasonable expectation to place on parents. And right now what has happened is that we have placed the entire burden of managing a rapidly evolving technology that we never grew up with on the shoulders of parents. We've asked kids to use the force of their willpower to limit their use, even though in early adolescence, they're at a stage of brain development that makes it hard to control impulses, that makes you more susceptible to social suggestion and to social comparison. And so what has happened is we have kids using these platforms that are designed with some of the most talented engineers in the world, using some of the most cutting edge brain science to maximize how much time they spend on them. So when you tell a parent, hey, figure it out, when you tell a child, develop more willpower, you're essentially pitting a child and a parent against some of the most well-resourced companies and talented product engineers in the world. That is a definition of an unfair, right? And that's what parents are up against. And so I don't think it's a surprise then when you look at surveys and you see parents saying that the number 1 and 2 reasons why they believe parenting is harder now than it was a generation ago is because of technology and social media. It's not because parents are less competent than they were a generation ago. It's not that kids have a genetic deformity in the willpower gene compared to prior generations, right? What has changed is the environment around them. And it's our job as a society to make that environment safer so that the burden on parents and kids is much more reasonable and manageable.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. This leads us to our next question. Social media is everywhere that it's used. Parents can feel helpless and overwhelmed about what they can do to safeguard the mental health and well-being of their children. What can they do? What suggestions do you have for parents and caregivers to create a better environment for social media use?
Yeah, well, this is something I honestly think about a lot for my own kids, because, even though you might think, your kids are small, you don't have to worry about this yet. They're 6 and 7. My daughter, who's 6 and who's in kindergarten, last year when she was in preschool, she came home one day and she was doing something cute, as kids often do at that age. And so we took a picture of her and she asked us if we could post it on Instagram. Now, she was in preschool. We actually don't use Instagram like for our personal accounts, like my wife and I. Well, where did you hear about this? So it turns out her preschool classmates were talking about posting pictures on Instagram, right? So we all have to worry about it at very young ages. And actually, just out of curiosity, how many of you either have kids or grandkids and have found it challenging to figure out how to manage social media in their lives? Yeah. So this is like a universal struggle that people are having. So the good news is I think there are some certain steps that parents can take. And I'll talk about those in a moment. But I want to say that one of the most important things that we have to do, though, is make sure that we actually put safety standards in place, which means we need our legislators to take action here as well. And some, states on their own are trying to figure out what they can do because there hasn't been federal action, from Congress, to put in place a national safety standard that all platforms must adhere to. And while I certainly can appreciate states trying to do that, I think it is far better for us if we don't have a patchwork of solutions, but if Congress actually puts in place a solution that can support every family, right? That puts in place a standard that we can all believe in, that can actually be implemented. And look, social media has been around for 20 years. I think the fact that we have no meaningful safeguards that have been put in place by our federal legislators during that time period, to me, is outrageous. It represents, I think, a fundamental failure of our sacred responsibility, which is to take care of our kids. And that's why in our advisory, I specifically called on Congress to stop the delays and to actually put in place safety standards with teeth and to implement them, and to do so with the input of parents and with the input of kids to make sure this works for our children and families everywhere. Because, again, we need to support families in this regard. We can't leave it all, put everything on their shoulders. But I do think that there are steps that families can take while legislators are putting those safety standards in place. And none of the things I'm going to tell you to do are easy. Let me just say that at the get-go. And all of them are hard if you are doing them alone.
which is why I think one critical thing we have to do as parents is we have to support one another and partner with one another in doing this. Because when your child comes up to you and says, you know, Susie and Johnny and Katie are all on social media, as is every other member of my class. That's where everything is happening. Do you really want me to be left out? Do you want me to be alone and isolated? What are you supposed to say as a parent, right? That's a very hard position to put you in. No parent wants to leave their kids like isolated and make them feel left out. But if you're able to say, hold on, back up, I talked to Katie and Susie and Johnny's mom. I talked to their dad. And we all decided that we're actually going to wait until you start using social media, or we all decided we're going to put certain restrictions in place, then it becomes a lot easier for kids. This is something I actually, when I was with the high school students earlier today here in Lincoln, it's something we actually talked about, because there are a couple of classmates of theirs whose parents said, you know, we're not going to let you use social media yet. And so they've been off of it. And I said, well, what is their life like being off social media? They said, well, they seem to know less about like everything that's going on throughout the high school, but they're really involved in a lot of activities. They have good friends, they hang out with us, and they're part of our community. So they seem pretty happy. But the point is, this is a lot easier to do when we're together. So what are the things? So first thing I would do, and everything I'm telling you is the things that I'm planning to do for my own kids. And I'm planning to partner with other parents to do this too in our school community. The first is to try to delay the use of social media until after middle school, at a minimum. And the reason for that is because it is in middle school, early adolescence, that kids are at their most sensitive phase of development when it comes to, again, sensitivity to social comparison, when it comes to impulse control, when it comes to their sensitivity to social suggestion, right? So if you can protect them during that critical time, that's really vital. The second thing I would do is, if your child is already on social media, is to think about a few key areas in their life that you can protect by making them tech-free zones. And so here are the areas that I would consider. They're all areas that are vital to their development and growth. The first is sleep, right? So right now, about a third of adolescents are staying up until midnight or later on school nights using screens, and much of that is social media use. So if you can, for example, say, okay, 1 hour before we go to bed, I'm telling you things, suggestions actually I've heard from a lot of parents around the country that they're now implementing. You can say an hour before bedtime, all phones go in the kitchen, they're going to be charged, and you get them back in the morning. So you're not like getting up every 2 minutes looking at them for when you get up to drink water, but then you're on social media for like half an hour. Like you think you're going to bed and you're just lying there in bed, like I'll just scroll for 10 minutes, and an hour and a half later, you're still there. Like you're not having that experience. By the way, this happens to adults too, as I'm sure many of you have experienced. I have too. But so that's one thing, protect sleep. And by, an hour before sleep and throughout the night, you keep the device away. The second is to protect in-person interaction, to make that a tech-free zone. And that could just start with dinner time, right? When you're all together at dinner time or whatever other time works for you during the day, say, you know what, for this hour that we're together, everyone's putting their devices away. Okay, and we're just going to actually talk to each other, as like 20th century as that might seem. We're going to actually look at each other and talk to one another. The third area I would work to protect is learning, right? So one of the things I was actually really happy to hear from the high school students earlier today was that they have a policy in their school where there's no phone use allowed during classroom time, right? And that's really important, because it's like, it was hard enough to like learn geometry and economics and history, like when you're paying attention. Like when you're also trying to post and look at what somebody else posted and scroll through your feed while you're learning, I mean, that's just very, very difficult. And so making sure that learning time in school, as well as, at home when your kids are doing their homework, is advisory, can also help. So those are three areas I would consider. But the last thing I would just suggest is that there's great power actually to the example that we set, like for our kids. And I say this knowing that like this struggles that kids have with devices, a lot of adults have too. A lot of parents, right? These are not designed, to make it easy to put down, right? And we too get sucked into comparing ourselves to other people a lot. I've seen in my own life over the years a shift in my mood when I'm feeling great, having a good day, then suddenly I go on social media, like look at stuff. I'm like, oh my God, this person's doing that. Should I be doing that? Like, what's going on here, there, da. So that's led me to have to put like barriers and boundaries in my own life around the use of social media. So if we can demonstrate and lead by example in our children's lives, it just goes a long way. Because as my good friend told me, like before I had my first child, he said to me, Vivek, I know you're about to become a parent, so let me drop some knowledge on you here. He's like, your kids may sometimes listen to what you say. Sometimes. He said, but they'll much more often listen to what you do. And even though you think they're not looking, they're not watching, they're taking their cues from you about what's okay, what's not okay, where the boundary is. So I've tried to remember that advice in my own life. And and sometimes I have failed. I remember one particular day coming home from the office. This is when I was serving during my first term. And my son was born when I was actually serving during my first term, which created all sorts of other challenges. But the thing that I was making sure to protect was his bedtime and bath time in the evening, right? So I would make it a point to come home, and my wife and I would give him a bath. We would read him stories, we'd feed him dinner, we'd get him ready for bed, and we put him to bed. And at some point in the middle of the bath routine one day, my wife turned to me and she said, "What are you doing?" And I realized that even though that was like my sacred hour of the day where I was with my newborn child, that somehow my hand had snuck into my pocket and pulled out my phone, and I was scrolling through my inbox and looking at something on the news. And she said, she very calmly, and my wife is very calm, by the way. She's like, she's a saint. But she just said to me, "You really need to be doing that right now." But even though she was calm, I cut like a knife, And I can actually still feel the guilt that I felt. But I was like, but we all have those struggles, right? And it took her just, helping hold me accountable in that moment. And I remember that ever since. I'm like, you know what? I don't need to be doing that. When I'm with him, let me focus on him. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that my kids are really watching. They notice sometimes what we're doing with our devices. Sometimes when my wife and I are talking to each other, every now and then, we'll check something on our phone when we're talking to each other, and we notice that they reference that. These kids. So anyway, that's the last thing I would just offer is I do think that there's great power to our example, but just to reinforce what I said at the beginning, this is all hard when we're alone. And if you find it hard to do alone, it doesn't mean that you're weak-willed or something. It's because behavior change is hard, and when you're up against technology that's specifically designed to maximize how much time your kids spend on it, it's particularly hard. But if we can have each other's backs on this, if we can make pacts with one another and say, you know what, why don't we do this as a few families together? And why don't we hold each other accountable? It can help a lot. I've got two friends in my life who I do that with. When I had to have hand surgery in February of last year, and these two buddies of mine called me up. They said, "Hey, you're going to have a couple of days while you're recovering. That's a great time to make a change in your life. What change do you want to make?" And I said, "Well, one of the things I want to do is I want to stop using or checking social media because I realize it doesn't make me feel good." So they said, "Okay, great. We're going to hold you accountable to that." And every couple of days after that, they would message me, "How did today go? How did today go?" And it really helped. There was moments where I was feeling twitchy, like I wanted to just check. Oh, let me just see. I think I'm okay. I'll just check for 2 minutes. I'd remember, they just texted me yesterday. So we all need each other to to keep each other on the track. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just part of human behavior, human evolution. We've evolved like that for thousands of years. But we particularly need to lean on each other when it comes to making these kind of shifts and changes with our kids regarding social.
Thank you. You talk with kids across the country, and what suggestions do you have for children and adolescents to keep them safe in social media spaces?
Well, the thing I found about young people is that, and I found that today as well at the round table, they're just remarkably insightful. Like you might think, oh, they're just blindly walking through the social media experience. They're not at all. Their eyes are wide open, and many of them know both the benefits, but they're acutely aware of the harms that they're experiencing. The challenge they often have is that they may not feel like they're able to put the device down or break the connection with the device. There's also a collective action problem. So similar to how with parents, often we're dealing with this alone. A lot of times young people are not talking to each other about the challenges they're dealing with social media. They're just trying to manage it on their own. And so one of the things I often tell young people is to start with, this is something you should talk to your friends about. And don't feel like you're guilty, you failed because you're struggling on your own. If you talk to them, you'll realize that they're all struggling. And that's one of the things that comes up in all of our roundtables. There's great power. The young people usually leave those roundtables being like, oh, and now I've got other peers who I know are going through the same thing I'm going through. Maybe we can do this together. The second thing I often tell them is to trust some of their instincts here. Their instinct is telling them that they're not feeling good when they're using social media. They should pay attention to that, right? That's not normal, right? If something is not making you feel good consistently over time, that's a warning sign that something should change. And then the third thing that I often tell them is that taking breaks is okay, but we need to do that ideally in partnership with peers. And this is where I found it really interesting because I was down at the University of Miami I just finished a college tour that I was doing. Not for my kids. I'm not trying to get them into college next year. I'm not that kind of parent. But more a college tour that we were doing around loneliness and isolation, which is an issue that we issued a Surgeon General's advisory on last year because, and we can talk about this if you like, but a profound wave of loneliness and isolation that has swept across America that is affecting all age groups. 1 in 2 adults struggling with loneliness right now in America, but the numbers are much higher among young people. And we have found that when people struggle with loneliness and isolation, they're socially disconnected. It's not just a bad feeling, but it actually raises their risk for anxiety, depression, and suicide. It also raises their risk for heart disease, for dementia, for premature death. So much so that the mortality impact we see with social disconnection is similar to the mortality impact we see with smoking daily. It's even greater than the mortality impact that we see with obesity. And think about this, smoking, obesity, we think about those as classic public health issues, right? But it turns out that loneliness and isolation are issues that are just as profound in terms of their public health impact. So we've been doing this in a college tour, focused on loneliness and isolation. And I'll just say parenthetically that of all the events that I've done as Surgeon General over now almost 6 years, I have never seen the kind of demand and engagement that I saw at the college tour events, because this issue is affecting young people so deeply and they know it. And they would often ask me on the tour, how are we supposed to start conversations with other people when that's just not the culture anymore? And I would say to them, what do you mean it's not the culture anymore? And they'd say, well, if you don't know somebody, if people are usually listening to stuff on their earbuds or they're looking at their phone or they're, on their laptop, like it feels intrusive and it seems weird to just go up to someone, and talk to them. I was even in my own office, like talking to some folks about this, and one of the younger members of our team who just graduated from college, he turned around in the discussion. He said, I don't know anyone who's just gone up to someone they don't know and said hello. He's like, that's just weird. Like people just don't do that anymore. And so this is like what we were hearing from college students everywhere. But they would also tell us about how sometimes, interestingly, their experience of social media, by the one hand, it allowed them to stay in touch with, old friends or know what people are doing. It was a different quality of connection than actually talking to somebody face to face. And that gradual transfer of our interactions from offline to online has come with a diminishing of quality of interaction as well. So some of them, recognizing that, decided to take a break. And they did so, with a couple of partners. And at the University of Miami, this came about with one student who was in our group, told us, she said, I live 20 minutes from campus. I should be going to see my parents all the time. But I often find that when I have a 3-hour block, that I'll just be like, okay, I'm going to leave in 10 minutes. I'm just going to scroll through my feed on Instagram. And then 3 hours later, I'm still there and I've lost my window to go see my family. She's like this, and every head was nodding, all the other students, right? So she said, I just made a decision a couple months ago that I'm going to limit my use of social media to 45 minutes a day. And everyone gasped around the room, like, oh my God, this is such a big step. And she said, it's been amazing though. It's made such a huge impact on my life. And I feel so much better. So at the end of that roundtable, I asked them by show of hands, I said, how many of you would like to do what she did to set that limit? And they all said, we've tried, we just can't do it. I was like, what if you did it together? They're like, oh, that's a good idea. So now that group is going to do it together. Another university I was at, one of the students said, I just needed to take a break entirely. So I took a 2-month break. And I said, what did you feel during those 2 months? She said, the first 2 days I was twitchy. I wanted to go and check. She's like, but after that, she's like, I noticed these changes. She said, number one, is that I started to feel better about myself because I wasn't just constantly comparing myself to other people all the time. She said, I was also more focused on what I was doing, how I was living my life, and less guided by what other people said I should do in terms of applying for this internship or doing that or getting into this club. She said, the third thing I noticed, she said, I had fewer people that I was in touch with, but the people I was in touch with, they became really good friends and it was really fulfilling interactions and relationships. And I felt really happy, right? So these are the things that students can do. But again, it's much easier to do them together which is why like I've actually been really interested to see that there are student movements that are popping up around the country, including one called the Log Off movement, which is a movement where young people are coming together to help support one another in creating boundaries around their use of technology and talking more openly about how the use of tech is making them feel, and in trying to get back to some good old-fashioned in-person interaction. It's not to say that, again, that there's no use for technology, no role for tech, but I think our history and evolution over thousands of years has guided us to be people who interact with one another face to face. And that's how we build relationships, because we're not just hearing the content of what someone else is saying, we're reading their body language, we're paying attention to their facial expressions, to the tone of their voice. It's why we tend to be nicer in person than we do online, right? Because we're processing all of that together. Whereas when young people are primarily living online, they tell us that they feel like they're exposed to vitriol a lot, to sort of, they say everyone just seems to be really mean all the time, you know, like online, or they're making comments that are offensive, and they're about like how people look and this and that, or about what they believe and their ideas. We just behave differently when we're not in person. And so I do think that there's a great rebalancing that needs to happen, like in our lives right now. And all of us are part of helping engineer that. I think it's just vital though, because if we don't do it, stories and statistics are telling us that our children are not well. We are living in the middle of a youth mental health crisis that has claimed too many of our kids' lives, and far too many, you know, kids who have lost their happiness and well-being. And it's taken a toll on parents too. Like the big, sort of the dark secret behind the youth mental health epidemic is that there's a parent mental health crisis taking place as well, the shadow. If you look at rates of depression and anxiety among parents, are remarkably similar to what they are among. And I don't think those two are unrelated to one another. So we help kids, we can help parents as well.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. We have so many questions for you, but we do want to have a chance for the audience to ask questions. So I think we have staff that are picking up kind of index cards that have questions, and they'll be bringing them up shortly. While they're collecting other questions, this is one of the ones we have. You visit with youth all over the country. What are they saying about their social media use, and do they worry about it? And you did reference that. Would you add anything to that question?
Yeah, I know we talked mostly about this. I'll just say that they think about this a lot, and they talk about this everywhere I go, and they're worried about it, and they need help and support working through it, which is why I think it's one of the most important public health issues we've got to address.
This question says, how does social media impact loneliness? So what's the connection with social media use?
Well, I think that if social media can be used as a bridge to offline connection, it would be powerful. There were two groups I encountered 2 weeks ago when I was in London. Both started by young people. One was called the Lonely Girls Club, which was started on a few different social media networks. The other was called Andy's Men's Club, which was started by a rugby player whose brother took his own life. And both of these, use online interactions to gather people and then to set up the opportunity for in-person interaction. And I think that that can be really powerful. But I think that if we don't protect fiercely our opportunities for in-person interaction with families, with friends, with members of our community, that's when I think we lose out. And I think the pendulum has swung so much to one extreme for young people that their comfort with in-person social interaction has also diminished, because our social comfort is like a muscle, right? If we don't use that muscle, it gets weaker over time. It doesn't disappear, but it gets weaker. And then the next time you need to go and use it, it can feel harder or uncomfortable. Just like if you've, how many people have ever been on a gym routine and fallen off? I know nobody here, but I'll raise my hand. Okay, all right, some of you. Those of you who didn't raise your hand, I know you just don't want to admit it, but it's okay. But if you think for a moment about when you fell off the routine and the day you got back on, what was it like to go to the gym that first time? It's probably painful, right? Probably didn't want to go. It's probably the weights felt heavier. The run felt more exhausting, right? It was just harder. But then you went the next day, got a little bit easier. You went the third day, got a little bit easier. and then you felt better, like overall. And our social muscle is very similar. During the pandemic, many young people say they felt like they aged backward in terms of their social skills because it hit them at a particularly sensitive time of social development. And so now, even though we think, hey, everyone's been back interacting for a couple of years, but for many young people, they often say that it still feels like they're not back to where they were socially, pre-pandemic, and that muscle is still weak. So we've got to build that back up. And I think creating opportunities for in-person interaction, making schools places where kids can actually focus on each other instead of their devices, having those boundaries at home in terms of those tech-free zones we talked about, that can all help them build back that social muscle, which is really vital for their health.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. This question is about places or countries that seem to be getting things right in terms of social media safety. Examples you would point us to?
Yeah, well, interestingly, I mentioned I was just in the UK recently. In the year 2020, they actually did pass a law that's essentially similar to what California did, which was an age-appropriate design code, which was designed to actually create safety features on these platforms that are used by kids. And now that is the stages of being implemented. I think, and Europe has also taken steps here. These all show us that it is possible to make progress, right? But we have to be very intentional about doing it because this is a complicated issue. No question about it. But I don't know. I just think about this as a father, and I think, and for those of you who are parents or grandparents who have kids that you care about in your life, if I told you that your child was in imminent danger, right? I suspect that there is nothing that you would not do to go protect your child. You would drop work, you would drop anything, you'd get in your car, you'd go wherever you need to go, you would go do what needed to be done to protect your child. And that's why as a father, I look at the threat that our kids face in terms of the mental health impact of social media. I look at the rising rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide. I look at the depths of a mental health crisis that is hurting and pulling apart families all across America. And I ask myself, what could be more important than protecting our children? Like, why aren't we pulling out the stops in terms of rules and safety features and requirements to make sure our kids are protected? Like, yes, I've been in DC for some years doing this job. I understand the culture of DC. I understand, the complexity of politics. But at some level, we can't be paralyzed by the complexity of the issue. We can't be paralyzed by politics. We have to fundamentally ask ourselves, what is more important than our kids' well-being? And the answer should be nothing. And get the job done. And so that's the message. And so that's the message I keep pushing there. But it's the message that, frankly, people need to hear from parents everywhere. Because, again, I just think that the wisdom and instinct that individual parents have of doing everything to protect the health and the well-being of their kids, that's the same wisdom that we have to bring to the lawmaking process when it comes to making social media safe.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. This one has to do with mindfulness. It says, I know you are a proponent of mindfulness. Can you anticipate a time when an intentional mindfulness curriculum will be a part of the K-12 education as a way to address social media addiction, loneliness, and isolation, and other public health issues?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, it's interesting. I think that there are a lot of mindfulness is a pretty good practice that I've become familiar with over the years, and many friends who have been part of mindfulness sort of trainings and practices. But the point of mindfulness, so I want to zoom out from that for a moment and just sort of say that the point of mindfulness practice is to allow us to quieten the noise around us and allow us to sort of focus on our inner peace. And if you think about it, that's something that increasingly a lot of us need in our life. We need something in our life that can help us quieten the noise, because there's a lot of noise, right? Like these devices that we hold in our pocket are bringing us headlines 24/7, right? They're bringing us messages and alerts and notifications. Everywhere we go, we see TVs up, in the airport, here, there, and everywhere that are constantly throwing news at us, right? On social media, we got friends who are posting all kinds of stories. Like information is coming at us in a way that just wasn't true when I was growing up. It's like the volume dial has been dramatically turned up. And there's no time to turn it down. There's no space you can go when it ratchets backward, right? And so we need something in our life that can help us find that peace and quieten that noise. Now, for some people, that may be prayer. I grew up in a family where faith was very important, and prayer and spiritual practice was an important part of how we found our center again. But it can be other things for people. It may be time in nature. Nature has extraordinarily healing properties, and it can be an incredible source of peace. But we become over time more disconnected from nature. That may not be true here in Lincoln, where you're surrounded by a lot of beauty, and you might have a chance to actually get out, perhaps more than folks who are maybe living in Manhattan or other cities where they're in a bit of a concrete jungle. But the point is that whether it's your spiritual practices, whether it's nature, whether it's a practice like mindfulness meditation, we need something in our lives, and our kids also need something in their lives that they can reach for to help quieten that noise and feel grounded. Because the truth is that it's our grounding, right, that helps us be rooted during storms, right? The storms that will come in our life, right? And right now, and my mother, this is something my mother taught me. My mother was my first sort of spiritual teacher, if you will, in life. And she always taught me, she said, like, when your faith is strong, when your ties to family are deep, when you feel like you're committed to your community around you, she said, those are your roots. And during hard time, those roots will keep you steady. So even if you sway and you bend, you won't break. But when you don't have those, when people are struggling with loneliness and isolation, when they don't have other tools in their life, and we've seen a decline in participation in faith institutions, for example, over the years, and participation in service organizations, in recreational leagues, when you don't have ties to family, to friends, to community, to purpose, then you don't have those deep roots. And then when storms come, then you fall over. And not even just storms, but sometimes even just regular, events in life. And that's why sometimes when you talk to people right now, so many people across America tell me, younger and older, that even routine adversity today can feel utterly overwhelming because they feel like they're at the end of their rope. They're dealing with a whole lot, but the resources that they used to have that anchored them have also dried up and shriveled and diminished over time. Right? I think as human beings that we're remarkably resilient when we are tethered to one another, when we have something that we believe in, a strong sense of purpose. Right? We can endure extraordinary hardships, the things that like humanity endured during World War II. Right? The things that challenges that we have faced. I remember growing up and experiencing Hurricane Andrew in South Florida in 1992, when that hurricane Category 5 blew through South Florida and leveled homes. I watched pieces of homes fly by, and as I was sheltering, like in a building with my mother and father and sister, it devastated the entire community. But because people were bound to one another in the days that followed, like neighbors took care of neighbors, people brought food to one another, they rebuilt that community even stronger than before the hurricane. We can do incredible things as human beings, but we can do them when we're rooted, when we're tethered to one another, when we have a purpose that we believe in. And that's what we have to make sure our kids have. One of the things that worries me is when I go to roundtables with young people and I ask them, well, how they define success, right? And what they tell me about is how society is telling them to define success. And they say, society is telling me that I've got to build my brand to be successful. They use that term a lot, build my brand. I got to build my brand, right? And what does it mean to build your brand? Well, to build my brand means that I've got to get a lot of followers on social media. I got to become famous, because they look at these people. I got to become an influencer, right? Now, not doing all that is fine, right? There's nothing against somebody who wants to become famous, right? There's nothing wrong with somebody who wants to become an influencer. The key question is that going to bring you fulfillment and happiness? And we play that experiment out. And I will tell you, from the many people I know who are rich, who are powerful, who are famous, many of them are fundamentally unhappy. And what many of them will tell you who are happy is that it was not the fame, the power, or the wealth that made them happy. They thought it would, but then they realized at the end that it was something else. And that something else is what I learned actually from my care of patients over the years. Because I had the privilege as a doctor of sitting with patients toward the end of their life, in the last few days of their life. and holding their hand and listening to their stories as they reflected on what really mattered in their life. And they didn't talk about how many followers they had on Instagram. They never talked about how much money was in their bank account or how big their corner office was. What they reliably talked about across the board was their relationships. They talked about the people they loved, talked about the people who loved them, talked about the people they wished they had spent more time with. See, because in the final analysis, when only the most meaningful strands of our life remain, what rises to the top are our relationships. They're our most important anchor to one another. And it's why it's so essential that we cultivate and build those relationships in our lives and in our children's lives. If we do that, we'll give them deep roots, the foundation for fulfillment, for standing up in the face of adversity, and for ultimately finding happiness, which is what we all want for.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Murthy. One of our goals in Lincoln is to become the healthiest city in the country. And your words of wisdom and expertise will echo and reverberate across our community so we can take some action in this important issue. It's been a delight to have you here, and we hope you come back.
Oh, well,
we're inviting you back already.
Well, that's very nice of you. No, that's so kind of you. I really appreciate this, the commitment of the community, that certainly our mayor here in Lincoln, as well as the endowment, to really invest in health and well-being here. And I know our time is running to a close. I'll just maybe share one last thought here, which is that I think it's going to take this kind of community focus for us to rebuild that foundation for health and well-being. But I also want to say that I do think that that our greatest strength, I feel, as communities, as a country, have not always just come from the kind of institutions we've built and the places where we've invested our resources, but they've also come from the fundamental values that we have decided are important, that we want to invest in kids. I'm the son of immigrants who came here from India many years ago. And when my parents came, I remember growing up about the image of America that they imparted to me, because it wasn't easy for them to come to America. They had to fight to come to this country. They really wanted it. And I asked them why. And the image that they gave me of America was as of a nation of compassionate, courageous optimists. That's what they told America. They said this is a place where there are all kinds of people, they believe different things, they have different backgrounds, but this is a place where they aspire to do big things, to look out for one another, and even in the face of adversity, to be courageous and bold. And they liked that. They wanted their son and their daughter to grow up in a country that judged people not by the color of their skin or what caste they were from or what their accent was like, but they judged them by their willingness to work hard, their willingness to be a part of a community. They recognized that just by being a human being, they had fundamental worth, right? That's what they wanted. And to me, those values are still true, right? They're still important. At times, it may feel like they're buried, under all of the challenged and polarized conversation that we see in our country right now. But I do think that we have to keep these core values at the forefront as we rebuild the foundation. And I, again, think about this just very personally, like for my own kids. Like when I found out I was going to be a dad, it was one day I came home from work during my first term, and my wife Alice was sitting at the dining table, and she was smiling. I was like, "Oh, what's going on? Something great happened today?" And then I looked in the table, and there was a pregnancy test indicator, and it was positive. And I just felt, for those of you who are parents, or you just know that feeling is overwhelming when you find out that you're going to become a mom or a dad, and you feel all the joy, and then you feel all the anxiety. How am I going to do this? Like, who's going to teach me how to change a diaper, much less like raise a child and bring them into the world? But the thing that actually I found myself worrying about in the days that followed was, and this was 2016. It was a time where, there was a lot of challenges, like in the country, in terms of there was a lot of violence that was taking place in the community. There was a lot of polarization that was getting worse. There was a lot of challenges, right? And I looked at all of that, and I asked my wife, I was like, what kind of world are we bringing our kids to? And it felt like there was a lot of fear in the world. And that fear was manifesting as anger and as insecurity and as vitriol and as division. And that we were pulling apart instead of pulling together. And we looked at that and we said, you know, what we really want for our children, we're blessed to have this baby and to hopefully have more, is we want our child to be raised in a world that's powered not by fear, but powered by love. Everything I've learned in my life from Scripture is that, and Scriptures I've studied across faith tradition, is that love is our greatest power. Right? It's when it informs how we treat each other, when it informs our purpose in the world, then beautiful things happen. And that love can manifest as kindness, as compassion, as generosity. But I thought with my kids, like that's what I want for them, because when my kids stumble, I want to know that there's somebody who's going to be there to lift them up. I want to know that when somebody else stumbles, that my child will go and lift them up too. Right? I want to know that if my kid makes a mistake or uses the wrong word with the best of intentions, that he's not going to get castigated or looked down upon, but that somebody will give him the benefit of the doubt and will pay attention to his intention, even if the words came out wrong. And I want him to do the same for others. Like that's the world that I want for all of our children. A world that's driven by love, that's powered by love, that's fueled by love, not by fear. But the work of building that world is a work that all of us have to do together. And every time we reach out to somebody from a place of love, whether it's to recognize that someone's having a hard time and to just offer a kind word, or whether it's to bring somebody into a circle who may be feeling lonely or isolated, or even ourselves to be bold enough to ask for help when we need it. Those are moments where we tip the scales in our world away from fear and towards love. That is the most important task I feel that we all have before us, because we have it within us to create such a world. And if we do, we will thrive and our kids will thrive. And if we do so, I hope we will always remember that of all the medicines that we have in the world, we've got some powerful ones. I've written prescriptions for many of them over the years as a doctor. But I can also tell you that there's no medicine that's more powerful than love and its ability to heal, to bring us together, and to help us forward. So that is my hope for Lincoln. That's my hope for all of America. And that's my hope for what we can do together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.